Story 1: The Night Shift at Oakwood Library. I never believed in the supernatural until I took the night shift at Oakwood Public Library. The pay was decent for a college student, and I figured spending my evenings surrounded by books in peaceful silence would be the perfect job. I was wrong about the peaceful part. Oakwood Library was built in 1892, a massive Victorian structure that had somehow survived urban development and two major renovations. During the day, it bustled with families, students, and elderly patrons shuffling between the stacks. But after 9 p.m., when the last patron left and the heavy oak doors were locked, the building transformed into something entirely different. My supervisor, Mrs. Chen, had worked there for 23 years. On my first night, she walked me through my duties, shelving returned books, basic cleaning, and maintaining security. The building settles at night, she told me, her voice echoing in the empty main hall. You'll hear creaking, maybe some books falling, it's normal. The heating system makes noise too. She paused by the circulation desk, her fingers drumming nervously on the wooden surface. But if you hear footsteps, well, you'll figure it out. I thought she was just trying to spook the new guy. The first few nights passed without incident. I fell into a routine, start on the third floor and work my way down, wheeling my cart through the narrow aisles while listening to podcasts through earbuds. The building did make noise, boards creaking, pipes settling, the occasional thump from the old radiators. Nothing unusual for a century-old building. It was on my fourth night that I first heard them. I was on the second floor in the local history section when I heard distinct footsteps coming from above. Not the random creaking I'd grown accustomed to, but the deliberate sound of someone walking across the wooden floor. Slow, measured steps that started near the reference section and moved toward the children's area. I pulled out my earbuds and listened. The footsteps stopped. "Hello," I called out, thinking maybe a patron had somehow been locked in after closing. My voice echoed through the building, but no one answered. I climbed the stairs to the third floor, my footsteps loud in the silence. The motion sensor lights flickered on as I moved through each section, casting long shadows between the stacks. I checked every aisle, every reading nook, even the small study rooms. Nothing. When I returned to the second floor, 3 books lay open on a table that had been empty when I'd left. All were local history books, open to pages about the library's construction. I stared at them for a long moment before closing each one and returning them to their proper places. The next night I arrived determined to solve the mystery. I'd convinced myself there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe the building had structural issues that created the illusion of footsteps, or perhaps the books had been left by a patron and I simply hadn't noticed them earlier. This time the footsteps began around 11 p.m. They started on the third floor again, but this time they moved differently. Instead of walking toward the children's section, they seemed to pace back and forth near the old periodical archives. I grabbed a flashlight and headed upstairs immediately, taking the steps 2 at a time. The motion sensors activated as I reached the landing, but as the lights flickered on, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A child's laughter, soft and distant, coming from somewhere in the stacks. "Hello," I called again, more urgently this time. "Is someone there? You're not supposed to be here after hours." The laughter stopped abruptly, replaced by the sound of books being pulled from shelves. I could hear them hitting the floor somewhere deep in the maze of aisles, one after another, like someone was systematically emptying an entire section. I followed the sound, my flashlight cutting through the shadows between the tall shelves. But when I reached the area where the noise had been coming from, everything was perfectly in order, not a single book out of place. I was beginning to understand what Mrs. Chen had meant. Over the following weeks, the incidents escalated. The footsteps became more frequent, sometimes accompanied by the sound of chair legs scraping across the floor or books being opened and closed. I began to recognize patterns. The activity always started on the third floor around 11 p.m. and gradually moved down through the building. By 3 a.m., things would quiet down, only to resume briefly just before sunrise. I tried researching the library's history during my breaks. The building had served as a library since its construction, but before that, the land had been home to Oakwood Elementary School. The school had burned down in 1891, and according to newspaper archives, 7 children had died in the fire. The library had been built on the same site as a memorial to them. That explained the children's laughter, but it didn't make working alone any easier. The breakthrough came during my 6th week on the job. I was shelving books in the children's section when I heard the familiar sound of footsteps approaching. Instead of investigating or calling out, I decided to simply continue working and see what would happen. The footsteps grew closer, stopping just at the end of the aisle where I was working. I could feel a presence behind me, but I forced myself to keep placing books on the shelves, my hands trembling slightly as I worked. "You can hear us," a voice said softly. It was a child's voice, clear and distinct, coming from somewhere near my shoulder. I turned around slowly. The aisle was empty, but I could see my breath in the suddenly cold air. "Yes," I whispered, not sure why I was whispering. "I can hear you." The others couldn't, the voice continued. "Mrs. Patterson tried to ignore us. Mr. Williams quit after 2 days, but you listen." I stood there in the dim light, talking to empty air, but somehow it felt like the most natural conversation I'd ever had. "What do you want?" I asked. "We just want someone to know we're here." Another voice joined the first, slightly older but still clearly a child. "We used to play in the schoolyard where the library is now. We didn't mean to stay, but we got confused when the fire happened. We've been here ever since." Over the next few months, my night shifts took on an entirely different character. The children, I learned there were 5 of them who regularly made themselves known, began to trust me. They would tell me about their lives, about the day of the fire, about all the people who had worked in the library over the years. Emma was 8 and loved stories about princesses. She would sometimes move children's books to my cart, always fairy tales and adventure stories. Thomas was 10 and fascinated by the historical books about local shipwrecks. He would leave them open to specific pages, sharing details about storms and lost vessels that weren't in any of the text. Sarah, who was 6, rarely spoke but would sometimes hum lullabies that echoed through the building just before dawn. The twins, Lucy and James, were 9 and seemed to enjoy playing pranks, hiding my flashlight, rearranging the items on my cart, or creating elaborate book displays that I would find in the morning. I began to look forward to my interactions with them. They were children, after all, and despite being dead for over a century, they retained all the curiosity and playfulness you'd expect. They would ask me about the modern world, about the computers in the library, about why people carried small rectangular devices that lit up. But it was Thomas who finally explained why they had revealed themselves to me. "There's going to be another renovation," he told me one night as I was working in the reference section. "We heard the library board talking about it during their last meeting. They want to tear down the old sections and build new ones." I had heard rumors about modernization plans, but nothing concrete. "We're scared," Thomas continued. "When they renovated before, some of us got lost. Rebecca and William disappeared when they tore down the old reading room. We can't find them anywhere." The children weren't just haunting the library, they were anchored to specific parts of it. If those sections were destroyed, they would be lost forever. I started paying attention to the renovation discussions, attending public meetings and reading board minutes that were available online. The plans were more extensive than I'd realized. The entire 3rd floor would be gutted and redesigned, along with significant changes to the 2nd floor. That's when I realized why the children had chosen to trust me. They needed an advocate among the living. I began documenting everything. I recorded the stories the children told me about the original school, took photographs of the sections they frequented most, and researched the history of each child who had died in the fire. I compiled a comprehensive report about the historical significance of preserving the original architecture. When I presented my findings to the library board, I focused on the historical preservation angle rather than mentioning any supernatural encounters. I argued that the building's original features were an important part of the town's heritage, and that the renovation should work around these elements rather than destroying them. The board was initially skeptical, but when I showed them the research I'd compiled, much of it information that the children had provided about the original school layout and the lives of the students who had attended, they began to take notice. Some of the details I'd uncovered weren't in any official records, but when they investigated further, they found confirmation in private family documents and church records. The renovation plans were modified to preserve the historical sections while still modernizing the library's functionality. The 3rd floor would keep its original layout, with updates to electrical and climate control systems, but no major structural changes. On my last night before the renovation began, I stayed late to say goodbye to the children. They seemed more solid than usual, as if the knowledge that their space would be preserved had strengthened their connection to it. "Thank you," Emma said, her voice clear in the quiet library. "We were so scared we'd have to leave." "Will you still be here when the work is finished?" I asked. "We think so," Thomas replied. "But even if we're not, at least we know someone heard our stories. Someone knows we were here." I graduated that spring and took a job in another city, but I still returned to Oakwood Library occasionally. The renovation was completed beautifully, preserving the historical character while making the building more functional for modern needs. Sometimes, when I visit during evening hours, I think I catch a glimpse of a child's shadow between the stacks or hear the distant sound of laughter from the children's section. The new night shift worker, a young woman named Sarah, always seems to be smiling when I see her working. She has a peaceful expression that suggests she's not working alone. Mrs. Chen retired shortly after I left, but before she did, she told me something that still gives me chills. "You know," she said, "in all my years here, you were the first night worker who never complained about being scared. Most people quit within a week. I always wondered what made you different." I never told her about the children. Some secrets belong to the library itself, but sometimes, when I'm in a library anywhere, I find myself pausing to listen carefully. Because now I know that buildings this old, buildings filled with so many stories and so much history, are never truly empty. They're filled with memories, with echoes of everyone who ever found comfort between their walls. And sometimes, if you listen carefully enough, those echoes might just listen back. Story 2: The Property Manager. I've been a property manager for 15 years, and I thought I'd seen everything. Broken pipes, late-night noise complaints, tenant disputes, even the occasional break-in. But nothing in my experience prepared me for 1247 Maple Street. The building came into our company's portfolio last spring when the previous management firm suddenly terminated their contract. No explanation given, just a terse letter stating they would no longer be representing the property. That should have been our first red flag. 1247 Maple Street was a converted Victorian mansion divided into 6 apartments. 3 floors, each floor containing 2 units. The building was gorgeous, high ceilings, original hardwood floors, intricate crown molding. It should have been one of our most desirable properties. Instead, it had a vacancy rate of 60%, and the tenants who did live there never stayed longer than 6 months. My boss, Jennifer, assigned the property to me with a simple directive: figure out what's wrong with this place and fix it. We're hemorrhaging money. I started by interviewing the current tenants. There were only 2, Mrs. Rodriguez in 2A, an elderly woman who had lived there for 3 months, and David Kim in 3B, a graduate student who had moved in just 6 weeks earlier. Mrs. Rodriguez was hesitant to talk at first. When I knocked on her door, she peered at me through the chain lock for a full minute before letting me in. Her apartment was immaculate but sparse, as if she hadn't fully unpacked or committed to staying. "It's the sounds," she said when I asked if she had any concerns about the building. "At night, always at night, footsteps in the hallways, doors opening and closing. I thought it was the other tenants at first, but..." She gestured around her apartment. "There aren't many other tenants." She walked to her kitchen window, which faced the building's interior courtyard. "And there's the woman in 1B, she said quietly. "I see her sometimes in the window across the way, but that apartment is supposed to be empty." I checked my files. 1B had been vacant for 8 months. David Kim was more direct. He invited me in for coffee and laid out his concerns like a scientist presenting data. "I'm not superstitious," he began, "but there are things happening here that don't have logical explanations. My electricity goes out randomly, but only in certain rooms and never for long enough to trip the circuit breakers. I hear music from downstairs, always the same song, but 1A has been empty since before I moved in." He pulled out a small notebook. I started documenting incidents. Temperature drops of 15 to 20 degrees in specific areas of my apartment, always in the same spots. Sounds of conversation coming from the walls. And twice I've come home to find my furniture rearranged. Rearranged how, I asked? Small changes. A chair moved 3 feet to the left, books stacked differently. Nothing dramatic, nothing that couldn't be explained by forgetfulness, but I'm very careful about these things. I notice changes. That evening, I decided to spend some time in the building after dark. I had keys to all the units, and I wanted to see if I could replicate the experiences the tenants had described. I started in the basement, checking the electrical panels and heating system. Everything seemed to be in working order, but I noticed that the basement temperature was noticeably cooler than the rest of the building. Not unusual for a basement, but this felt different. The cold seemed to come from specific areas rather than being evenly distributed. I made my way to the first floor and let myself into 1A, the supposedly empty apartment. The unit was clean and unfurnished, ready for showing to prospective tenants. But as I walked through the rooms, I began to understand why it remained vacant. The apartment felt wrong. I can't describe it more precisely than that. The proportions seemed off, even though I knew the layout was identical to the other units. Shadows fell strangely, even with all the lights on. and there was a persistent smell of cigarette smoke, despite the fact that smoking wasn't allowed in the building and the previous tenant had been a non-smoker. I was taking notes in the living room when I heard it, piano music, faint but distinct, coming from somewhere below me. A slow, melancholy tune that seemed familiar but that I couldn't quite place. There was no piano in the building. I had been through every inch of it. I followed the sound to the basement, where it seemed slightly louder. As I stood at the bottom of the stairs, trying to locate the source, the music stopped abruptly. That's when I noticed the door. It was tucked away in a corner of the basement, painted the same gray as the walls, nearly invisible unless you were looking directly at it. In 15 years of property management, I had learned to notice every detail of a building, but somehow I had completely missed this door. I tried the handle, locked, none of my keys fit. The next day, I called the building's owner, Robert Chen, to ask about the locked room in the basement. There was a long pause before he answered. "I was wondering when someone would ask about that," he said finally. "It's been sealed since 1987, previous owner's instructions. We've never opened it." "What's in there?" Another pause. According to the records I inherited, it was a music room. The original owner, Margaret Whitman, was a piano teacher. She lived in the building and gave lessons in the basement room. "What happened in 1987? "Margaret died. Natural causes, but there were some unusual circumstances. The property sat empty for 2 years before my father bought it. He had the room sealed at the recommendation of the previous management company." I pressed for more details, but Robert seemed reluctant to discuss it further. He did give me permission to have the room opened, if absolutely necessary for property management purposes. That afternoon, I brought a locksmith to the building. He worked on the door for nearly an hour before admitting defeat. "It's not just locked," he told me. "It's been sealed from the inside. There's some kind of additional mechanism preventing it from opening. I need to remove the hinges or cut through the door frame." I authorized him to remove the hinges. As the door swung open, the first thing that hit me was the smell. Not unpleasant, but distinctive old wood polish, sheet music paper, and something floral that might have been perfume from decades past. The room was larger than I had expected, with high ceilings and excellent acoustics. In the center sat an old upright piano, its dark wood still gleaming despite the dust that covered everything else. Sheet music was scattered across the top and arranged in neat stacks on nearby shelves. But it was the walls that made me understand why the room had been sealed. Every inch of wall space was covered with writing, not graffiti or random scrawling, but neat, careful handwriting in what appeared to be multiple colors of ink. As I moved closer, I could see that it was all the same message, repeated thousands of times. "She's still in the music, she's still in the music, she's still in the music." I took photos of everything before closing the door and having the locksmith reseal it. But that night, as I was reviewing the pictures on my computer, I noticed something I had missed in person. In one corner of the room, barely visible in the dim light, was a different message. Where the repeated phrase was written in various colors of ink, this one was written in what looked like dark red or brown. "Margaret never left. She's in the walls now. She's in the music." The next morning, I drove to the city hall to research the building's history more thoroughly. What I found in the public records painted a clearer picture of what had happened in 1987. Margaret Whitman had indeed been a piano teacher. She had lived in the building's third-floor apartment and taught lessons in the basement room. According to neighbors who were interviewed after her death, she had been experiencing some kind of mental health crisis in the months before she died. Several tenants had complained about music being played at all hours of the night. Margaret claimed she wasn't playing piano after 8 p.m., as stipulated in her lease, but the music continued. When other tenants confronted her, she insisted that the piano plays itself when the music needs to be heard. The building was nearly empty by the time Margaret died. Only she and one other tenant remained, and that tenant moved out 2 days after Margaret's body was discovered. The cause of death was listed as cardiac arrest, but the circumstances were unusual. Margaret had been found in the basement music room, seated at the piano bench. Her hands were positioned on the keys as if she had been playing, but rigor mortis indicated she had been dead for at least 12 hours. What disturbed the police was that Margaret had somehow locked herself into the room from the inside, using a mechanism that couldn't be operated from outside. There was no other way out of the room. A maintenance worker had to remove the door hinges to get inside. Armed with this information, I returned to 1247 Maple Street that evening. I wanted to check something in apartment 3A, which had been Margaret's unit and was currently vacant. The apartment felt different from the others in ways that were hard to quantify. The layout was identical to 3B, where David lived, but the acoustics were strange. Sounds seemed to carry differently, and voices from other parts of the building were more audible than they should have been. I was taking measurements in the bedroom when I heard David's voice coming through the wall. He appeared to be talking to someone, though I knew he lived alone. "Understand what you're trying to tell me," he was saying, "but I can't help you if I don't know what you want." There was a pause, then David's voice again. "No, I can't hear you clearly. It's like listening to someone talking underwater." Curious and concerned, I knocked on David's door. He answered quickly, as if he had been expecting me. "I'm glad you're here," he said. "Can you hear her too?" "What? Hear who?" "The woman who talks through the walls. She's been trying to communicate for weeks now. I think she's been talking to all the tenants, but most people just move out instead of listening." "What?" We sat in his living room while David explained what he had been experiencing. The voice came primarily in the evenings, always from the direction of 3A. It seemed to be trying to communicate something urgent, but the words were indistinct. "I think she's stuck somehow," David said, "like she needs help with something but can't make herself understood." As we talked, the temperature in the room began to drop noticeably. David pointed to a spot near the wall that adjoined 3. "It always starts there," he said. I walked to the area he indicated and immediately felt the temperature difference. It was easily 15 degrees colder in that specific spot, and as I stood there, I began to hear what David was describing. It wasn't quite a voice, more like the echo of a voice, as if someone were speaking from very far away. The words were unintelligible, but the tone was unmistakably distressed. "Margaret," I said aloud, feeling somewhat foolish. The sound stopped immediately. Then, clearly and distinctly, I heard piano music coming from directly below us. David and I looked at each other. The sealed basement room was directly underneath where we stood. We went downstairs together and I unlocked the basement door. The music was louder here, definitely coming from behind the sealed door. It was the same melancholy tune I had heard on my first night in the building. "That's the song she plays every night," David whispered. "Always the same one." As we stood listening, the music gradually slowed and then stopped. In the silence that followed, we heard something else, a woman's voice clearer than before, speaking from inside the sealed room. "The music is trapped," she said. "It needs to be heard, it needs to be shared." "What?" I found myself responding without thinking. "Margaret, what do you need us to do?" "Open the room, let the music out. I've been trying to teach for so long, but no one stays long enough to learn." "What?" David looked at me questioningly. I made a decision that probably wasn't in the property management handbook. "I'll have the room opened permanently," I said to the door, "but you need to stop frightening the tenants. People need to be able to live here." "I'm not trying to frighten anyone," Margaret's voice replied. "I'm trying to share the music, but people don't listen anymore. They hear a piano and they run." "What?" Over the next week, I arranged to have the basement room properly opened and restored. I told Robert Chen that we wanted to add it as a common amenity space for tenants. He was surprisingly agreeable to the expense. The piano tuner I hired was amazed by the instrument's condition. "This is a beautiful piece," he told me. "Made in 1923, barely played. Someone took excellent care of it." "What?" When he began tuning it, the piano seemed to come alive. Each note rang out clear and pure, filling the basement with rich, warm sound. As he worked, I could swear I heard approval in the instrument's voice. That evening, I posted a notice in the building's lobby. "New amenity, music room available in basement for tenant use. Piano lessons available upon request." The change in the building was immediate and dramatic. The strange cold spots disappeared. The electrical problems stopped. David reported that he no longer heard voices through the walls, though he did sometimes hear beautiful piano music in the evenings. Most importantly, new tenants began staying. Within 2 months, we had a waiting list for units. I would occasionally find people playing the piano when I did my building inspections. Tenants had started leaving sheet music on the piano, and it was always arranged in neat stacks by the next day. Sometimes I would find notes written in the margins, helpful suggestions about fingering or tempo, always in the same careful handwriting I had seen on the walls. David started taking piano lessons. He would go down to the basement room in the evenings and practice scales and simple songs. He told me that sometimes it felt like someone was guiding his hands to the correct keys. "It's like having a very patient teacher," he said. "Someone who loves music so much that she can't stop sharing it even after death." Mrs. Rodriguez, who had been planning to move out, decided to stay. She bought a violin and would sometimes join the evening music sessions in the basement. She said the building felt warm and welcoming now, like a home instead of just an apartment. I never saw Margaret, but I felt her presence in the building regularly. She seemed to take pride in maintaining the property. Small maintenance issues would sometimes resolve themselves. Light bulbs that should have burned out lasted longer than expected. The heating system ran more efficiently. The building became one of our most successful properties. Tenants stayed for years instead of months, and many of them became accomplished musicians under Margaret's patient guidance. I was promoted to regional manager the following year, which meant I was no longer the direct property manager for 1247 Maple Street. But I still visit occasionally, usually in the evenings when I know the music room is active. On my last visit, I found a young girl, maybe 8 years old, playing a simple melody on the piano while her mother watched from a nearby chair. The girl's hands moved with surprising confidence for someone so young. "She's learning so quickly," the mother told me. "It's like someone is teaching her when I'm not watching. She comes down here every evening after dinner." As I listened to the music echoing through the building, I thought about Margaret, finally able to do what she had always loved. Teaching music to anyone willing to learn. Some ghosts, I realized, aren't trapped by tragedy or unfinished business. Sometimes they're just people who loved something so much that death couldn't make them stop sharing it. The piano music from 1247 Maple Street can sometimes be heard from the sidewalk on quiet evenings. Neighbors often pause to listen, and more than one has asked about rental availability. Margaret has found her audience at last. Story 3: The Archivist. I started working as an archivist at Clearwater University 6 months ago, and I thought it would be the perfect job for someone who loves history and solitude. The position involved cataloging and preserving documents in the university's special collections, most of which dated back to the institution's founding in 1894. The archive was housed in the basement of Whitman Hall, the university's oldest building. It was a maze of climate-controlled rooms filled with filing cabinets, storage boxes, and shelves that stretched from floor to ceiling. I was the only person who worked down there regularly. Researchers occasionally visited by appointment, but most days I worked alone among the thousands of documents that told the story of the university's 130-year history. My supervisor, Dr. Patricia Vance, had warned me that the work could be isolating. "Some people find the basement oppressive," she said during my orientation. "All that history, all those stories locked away in boxes. It can feel overwhelming." I assured her that I thrived in quiet environments and that being surrounded by historical documents was exactly what I wanted. For the first month, that was true. I fell into a comfortable routine. Arriving at 8 a.m., spending my days carefully examining documents, recording their contents in digital catalogs, and ensuring they were properly preserved. The work was meticulous and satisfying. I felt like I was helping to keep the university's history alive. It was during my second month that I first noticed the discrepancies. I was working on a collection of student records from the 1920s when I found a file that didn't match the others. The paperwork looked identical, same forms, same official seals, but the information was wrong. The student's name was listed as Eleanor Marsh, but according to the university's enrollment records, no one by that name had ever attended Clearwater. I assumed it was a filing error and set the document aside to research later, but as I continued working through the box, I found more anomalies. 3 more students who didn't appear in any official records, despite having complete academic files. Their documents looked authentic, down to the signatures and official stamps, but according to every database I checked, these people had never existed. I brought the discrepancies to Dr. Vance's attention. "Interesting," she said, examining the files. "We've found isolated incidents like this before. Sometimes documents get misfiled or there are clerical errors in the historical records. It's more common than you'd think." She handed the files back to me. "Create a separate collection for unverified documents. We'll research them when we have time." That seemed reasonable, but the unverified collection grew quickly. Over the next few weeks, I found dozens of documents referring to students, faculty, and events that had no corroboration in the official university records. Most disturbing were the graduation records. I found diplomas and transcripts for an entire graduating class from 1923, 47 students who, according to every official source, had never attended the university. The documents were too detailed and too consistent to be simple errors. They included course schedules, grade reports, disciplinary records, even letters of recommendation from professors whose names appeared nowhere else in the university's files. I started staying late to research these mysterious documents, using the university's online databases and historical archives to try to find some trace of these people in the official record. That's when I started noticing that I wasn't alone in the archive after hours. It began with small things. I would return from a coffee break to find documents arranged differently than I had left them. Books that I had been consulting would be opened to different pages. Sometimes I would hear the faint sound of papers rustling from other rooms in the archive, even though I was the only person with access after 5 p.m. One evening I was working late when I heard distinctly the sound of typing coming from the next room. Not the quiet tapping of a computer keyboard, but the heavy, mechanical sound of an old typewriter. I went to investigate and found the room empty, but I could smell something in the air, a faint scent of cigarette smoke and old paper. When I returned to my desk, I found a new document waiting for me. It hadn't been there when I'd left the room 5 minutes earlier. The document was a letter, written on university letterhead from 1923. It was addressed to the university president and signed by someone named Professor William Hartley. The letter was a recommendation for student admission, praising the academic potential of a young woman named Catherine Mills. Neither Professor Hartley nor Catherine Mills appeared in any official university records. But the letter was sitting on my desk, and the paper felt real under my fingers. I decided to change my approach to the investigation. Instead of trying to prove that these people had existed in official records, I started looking for evidence that they had lived at all. I spent hours in the city's historical society, looking through local newspapers from the 1920s. I checked cemetery records, birth and death certificates, property records, anything that might confirm that these mysterious students and faculty had been real people. What I found was even stranger than what I had expected. Catherine Mills, the student mentioned in Professor Hartley's letter, had died in a house fire in 1922, a full year before she supposedly enrolled at the university. Eleanor Marsh, the student whose file had started my investigation, had died of influenza in 1921. Every name I researched told the same story. The people in the unverified documents had all died before they could attend university, most of them in their late teens or early 20s. Yet someone had created detailed academic records for all of them, complete academic histories documenting the college experiences they never had the chance to live. I brought my findings to Dr. Vance, expecting her to be as puzzled as I was. Instead, she sighed and sat down heavily in her chair. "I was hoping this wouldn't happen," she said. "You knew about this." "What?" "I've known about it for 20 years, Dr. Vance said. "Every archivist who works down there eventually discovers the unverified collection. We've been dealing with it since the 1940s. "What?" She opened a filing cabinet and pulled out a thick folder. "These are reports from every archivist who has worked in that basement since 1945. They all describe the same phenomena. Documents appearing for people who died young, always people who wanted to attend university but never had the chance." I stared at the folder, which had to be 3 inches thick. "How is that possible?" "We don't know, Doctor," Vance said simply, "but we've developed a theory over the years. Clearwater University was built on the site of a residential neighborhood that was destroyed in a fire in 1923. 47 young people died in that fire, most of them recent high school graduates who had planned to attend college. The number hit me immediately. 47. That's the same number as the graduating class I found records for. "What?" "Exactly." Dr. Vance opened the folder and showed me photographs from the 1920s. This was Maple Street, where most of the victims lived. The university bought the land after the fire and built Whitman Hall directly over the old neighborhood. "What?" The photographs showed a tree-lined street with modest houses, many of them home to large families. Young people stood on porches and in yards, smiling at the camera with the confidence of those who had their whole lives ahead of them. "We think," Dr. Vance continued, "that somehow the archive has become a place where these young people can experience the education they never had. Someone or something is creating the academic records they would have earned if they had lived." "What?" I thought about the sound of typing I had heard, the smell of cigarette smoke, the way documents rearranged themselves when I wasn't looking. "Are they dangerous?" I asked. "Never," Dr. Vance said firmly. "In all the years we've been aware of this, there has never been a single incident of anyone being harmed. They seem to understand that they're guests, I suppose. They're remarkably respectful of the real documents and the work we're doing." "What?" She closed the folder and looked at me seriously. "The question is, can you live with it? Some archivists find it too unsettling and request transfers. Others adapt and even come to appreciate the company." "What?" I thought about my experience so far. The mysterious documents, the sounds of activity when I was alone, the sense that I was sharing the space with others. It should have been frightening, but instead it felt almost collaborative. "What happens to the documents they create? I asked. We keep them, Dr. Vance said. They're historically significant in their own way. They represent dreams and aspirations that were cut short. And honestly, they're some of the most meticulously accurate records we have. Whoever is creating them has an extraordinary attention to detail. Over the following weeks, I began to pay closer attention to the patterns in the archive. The activity always seemed to intensify in the evenings, particularly around the time when classes would be ending for the day. I started to recognize individual students by their work habits. Someone was particularly interested in literature courses and would often leave classic novels open to specific passages. Another seemed drawn to mathematics and engineering, leaving complex calculations worked out in neat handwriting on scratch paper. One evening, I decided to try communicating directly. I was working alone when I heard the familiar sound of papers being shuffled in the next room. Instead of investigating, I called out softly. "I know you're here," I said. "I want you to know that your work is appreciated. The documents you create are beautiful." The shuffling stopped. After a moment, I heard what sounded like a chair being pushed back from a desk. When I went to check the room, I found a handwritten note on the central work table. "Thank you for understanding. We only wanted to learn." The handwriting was neat and careful, the kind taught in schools in the early 1900s. Over time, I developed what could only be described as a working relationship with the archive's invisible students. They seemed to understand that I was there to preserve and catalog documents, and they were careful not to interfere with my official work. In return, I began leaving out materials they might find interesting, university course catalogs from different eras, textbooks, historical photographs of campus life. These items were always carefully examined and returned to exactly where I had left them. I also started finding study guides and detailed notes about various academic subjects written in that same careful handwriting. The quality of the work was extraordinary, better than most of the genuine student papers in our historical collections. Dr. Vance was right about the attention to detail. The mysterious students seemed to have access to information that should have been impossible for them to know. Their essays about historical events were more accurate than contemporary accounts, their scientific calculations more precise than the textbooks of their era. One particularly remarkable document was a detailed analysis of World War I written from the perspective of a 1924 student. The paper included information about battles and political decisions that wouldn't become public knowledge until decades later. "How do they know things that hadn't happened when they were alive?" I asked Dr. Vance. "We think they're not bound by linear time the way we are," she explained. "They seem to have access to information from across different decades, maybe different centuries. It's as if the archive exists in a space where all of university history is happening simultaneously." This explanation made sense of other phenomena I had observed. Sometimes I would find documents written on paper that looked decades old, but discussed events from the 1960s or 1980s. The invisible students seemed to be experiencing education not just from their own era, but from every era the university had existed. One evening, I was working late on a particularly challenging collection when I encountered a problem I couldn't solve. A box of documents had been damaged by water at some point, and many of the pages were illegible. I was trying to decipher a partially destroyed inventory list when I heard someone clear their throat softly behind me. I turned around, but the room was empty. When I looked back at my desk, I found a handwritten translation of the damaged document, complete and accurate. The handwriting was different from what I had seen before, more masculine, with the confident strokes of someone accustomed to academic writing. At the bottom of the page was a signature, Prof. William Hartley, History Department. Professor Hartley, whose recommendation letter had been one of the first mysterious documents I had discovered. From that point on, I began to understand that the archive was home not just to students who had died young, but also to faculty members who had planned to teach at the university, but never had the chance. They had created an entire phantom academic community in the basement of Whitman Hall, complete with professors, students, courses, and even graduation ceremonies. I found evidence of this phantom community throughout the archive. Course schedules that perfectly complemented each other, as if they were part of a real academic program. Letters of recommendation between faculty members who had never officially existed. Even what appeared to be minutes from faculty meetings discussing curriculum and student progress. It was a complete parallel university, populated by people who had died before they could fulfill their educational dreams. The most touching discovery was a collection of what appeared to be personal journals kept by the phantom students. They wrote about their studies, their hopes for the future, their friendships with classmates. They described campus life with the enthusiasm of young people finally getting the education they had always wanted. One entry, dated 1924, but written in Catherine Mill's neat handwriting, read, "I never thought I would have the chance to study literature at university level. When the fire took that possibility away, I thought all my dreams had died with me. But somehow, in this place between worlds, I've found professors who challenge me and classmates who share my passion for learning. Death may have ended my life, but it couldn't end my desire to grow and learn." Reading these journals, I began to understand why the archive felt so welcoming despite its supernatural nature. These weren't angry spirits or trapped souls. They were simply people who loved learning so much that they had found a way to continue their education beyond death. I started leaving encouraging notes for the phantom students, particularly during what I imagined were stressful times like finals. I would find thank you notes in return, always written in that careful early 20th century handwriting. One note, signed by several different hands, read, "Your kindness means more than you know. For so long, we studied alone." Having someone who acknowledges our efforts makes us feel like real students again. Dr. Vance told me that I was the first archivist to actively engage with the phantom community. Most previous archivists had either ignored the phenomena or requested transfers when it became too much to handle. "You've brought out the best in them," she said. "The documents they're producing now are more detailed and more helpful than anything we've seen in decades." She was right. The phantom students had begun creating supplementary materials for the genuine historical documents in our collection. If we had an incomplete file about a real person or event, I would often find carefully researched additions that filled in the gaps. They seemed to take particular pride in helping preserve the university's actual history, as if they understood that their own phantom existence was only possible because of the real institution they had never been able to attend. The relationship reached a new level one evening when I was struggling with a damaged box of photographs from the 1920s. Many of the images were faded or torn, and I was having difficulty identifying the people and events they depicted. I mentioned my frustration aloud, speaking to the empty archive as I often did. The next morning I found detailed notes about each photograph, identifying every person, providing dates and locations, and explaining the significance of each image. The information was accompanied by beautifully drawn copies of the damaged photographs, restored to show what they had originally looked like. The artwork was signed, Eleanor Marsh, class of 1923. Eleanor had apparently been an art student before her death, and she had used her talents to help preserve images of the university she had never been able to attend. This became a pattern. Each of the phantom students contributed their particular skills to help with archive work. The literature students helped with document analysis and writing style identification. The mathematics students assisted with calculations and data organization. The history students provided context and verification for historical claims. Working in the archive became a true collaboration between the living and the dead, all united by a shared love of learning and preservation. I had been working there for 6 months when I received the most remarkable document yet. It was a formal invitation, written on beautiful paper in elaborate calligraphy. "The class of 1923 cordially invites you to attend our graduation ceremony, to be held in the Whitman Hall Archive on June 15th at 8:00 p.m. Your support of our studies has meant everything to us, and we would be honored to have you witness this culmination of our educational journey." June 15th was a Friday. I had been planning to work late anyway, but this gave my evening a special purpose. At exactly 8:00 p.m., I sat in the main archive room and waited. The temperature dropped noticeably, and I could hear the sounds of movement throughout the archive. Footsteps in the corridors, muted conversations, the rustling of formal clothing. Then, clearly and distinctly, I heard applause. It lasted for several minutes, waves of enthusiastic clapping that seemed to come from dozens of people. I heard cheering, the kind of celebration you'd expect at any graduation ceremony. When the applause died down, I heard a voice, Professor Hartley, I was sure, speaking as if addressing a crowd. "We gather today to celebrate the achievements of 47 remarkable students who have demonstrated that the desire to learn transcends even death itself. Through their dedication and perseverance, they have proven that education is not merely about acquiring knowledge, but about the eternal human drive to grow and understand." More applause followed, and I found myself clapping along, tears running down my cheeks as I participated in a graduation ceremony for students who had been dead for nearly a century. When the sounds faded, I found a diploma on my desk, made out to me and signed by Professor Hartley. It was an honorary degree in archival collaboration, awarded in recognition of extraordinary service to the educational community of Clearwater University. I had it framed and hung it in my office, where it remains to this day. Working in the archive changed my understanding of what it means to be an educator and a preservationist. I learned that the desire to learn and grow is one of the most powerful human drives, strong enough to persist even after death. The Phantom students taught me that history isn't just about preserving the past, it's about honoring the dreams and aspirations of those who came before us, even when those dreams were never fulfilled in life. I still work in the Whitman Hall archive, and I still collaborate with the class of 1923. They continue to produce remarkable documents and provide invaluable assistance with research projects. New researchers occasionally ask about the sounds they hear in the archive: footsteps, conversations, the occasional burst of laughter from an empty room. I tell them what Dr. Vance told me: the archive is a place where history comes alive. If you listen carefully, you might learn something extraordinary. Most of them assume I'm being metaphorical. Some, the ones who stay late and pay attention, eventually discover the truth for themselves. The Phantom students are always eager to welcome new collaborators, living or dead, who share their passion for learning. After all, the best education happens when different perspectives come together in the pursuit of knowledge, even when some of those perspectives come from beyond the grave. Story 4: The Forest Service Ranger. I've been a Forest Service Ranger for 12 years, and I thought I understood the wilderness. I knew about dangerous animals, unpredictable weather, and the way the forest could disorient even experienced hikers. What I didn't know was that some parts of the forest operate by rules that have nothing to do with the natural world. My station is in northern Oregon, responsible for a section of old-growth forest that includes over 200 square miles of designated wilderness. It's beautiful country, towering Douglas firs, crystal-clear streams, and hiking trails that wind through some of the most pristine wilderness left in the Pacific Northwest. Most of my work involves routine patrols, trail maintenance, and helping lost hikers find their way back to marked paths. In 12 years, I had dealt with bear encounters, flash floods, rock slides, and every other natural hazard you could imagine. I had never dealt with anything that challenged my understanding of reality itself. That changed last spring when I was assigned to investigate reports of unusual activity in the remote northern section of my territory. The reports came from 3 separate groups of hikers over the course of 2 weeks, all describing similar experiences in the same general area. The first report came from an experienced backpacker named Michael Tours. He had been hiking alone on the Clearwater Trail when he became disoriented in an area he knew well. According to his statement, he had hiked the same trail dozens of times, but on this trip, familiar landmarks appeared in the wrong places. The trail split where it had never split before, he told me when he reported the incident. I followed what I thought was the main path, but after an hour of hiking, I found myself back at the exact spot where I had started. Like I had been walking in a circle, but the trail was straight. Michael was an engineer with orienteering experience. He wasn't the type to get confused about directions or distances. The second report was even stranger. A family of 4, the Johnsons, had been camping in a designated campsite when they heard sounds coming from the forest that they described as impossible. It sounded like a city, Mrs. Johnson explained. Car horns, construction noises, people talking on phones, but we were 15 miles from the nearest road. When they investigated the sounds, they found nothing but normal forest. But the urban noises continued sporadically throughout the night, always seeming to come from just beyond the range of their flashlights. The third report was the most unsettling. A group of college students had been day hiking when they encountered what they described as wrong trees. There was a grove of palm trees, one of them told me, in the middle of the Oregon forest. They looked completely real, but palm trees can't grow here. When we tried to get closer, we couldn't find them again. 3 separate incidents in the same remote area, all involving spatial disorientation and things that shouldn't exist. I decided to investigate personally. The Clearwater Trail was a moderate hiking path that wound through old-growth forest before connecting to several more challenging backcountry routes. I had patrolled it hundreds of times and knew every landmark, every trail junction, every camping spot, or at least I thought I did. I started my investigation at dawn, hiking at a steady pace toward the area where the incidents had been reported. The trail was in good condition and the morning was clear and warm. Everything seemed perfectly normal. About 6 miles in, I reached the area where Michael Tours had reported getting lost. I I knew this section well. The trail ran straight for nearly 2 miles through a grove of massive Douglas firs, with no side trails or confusing junctions. But as I walked, I began to notice subtle changes that didn't make sense. The spacing between the trees seemed different, not dramatically, but enough to make the familiar forest feel slightly off. Shadows fell at angles that didn't match the sun's position. And most disturbing, I began to see trails branching off from the main path that I had never noticed before. These weren't game trails or informal paths created by hikers. They were fully developed trails with the same maintenance standards as the official Forest Service routes. They had proper drainage, cleared undergrowth, and even trail markers, but the markers bore symbols I didn't recognize. I followed one of the mysterious trails for about a quarter mile before it ended abruptly at what appeared to be a solid wall of trees. Not a thick grove that you couldn't pass through, but an actual wall of tree trunks growing so close together that there were no gaps between them. When I turned around to retrace my steps, the trail was gone. I was standing in normal forest, surrounded by trees and undergrowth with no sign that a maintained trail had ever existed in that spot. I used my GPS to navigate back to the Clearwater Trail, which showed up exactly where it should have been according to my maps. But I was beginning to understand why the hikers had reported feeling disoriented. The forest was changing around me in ways that defied explanation. I spent the rest of the day mapping the area more carefully, using my GPS to mark waypoints and taking detailed photographs of landmarks. What I discovered was that while my GPS consistently showed the Clearwater Trail in its correct location, my direct observation revealed a much more complex network of paths and routes. Some of these alternate trails seemed to follow different rules of geography. I found one that appeared to loop back on itself, but when I walked it, I covered different terrain each time. Another led to a clearing that was simultaneously at the bottom of a valley and the top of a ridge, depending on which direction you approached from. Most unsettling was a trail that seemed to exist only in my peripheral vision. When I looked directly at it, I saw normal forest, but when I focused on other things, I could clearly see a well-maintained path in my side vision. That evening, I camped in the official campsite where the Johnson family had heard urban sounds. I set up my tent and prepared to spend the night listening carefully to whatever the forest might reveal. The first few hours were normal. I heard the typical sounds of a forest at night, wind in the trees, small animals moving through the undergrowth, the distant call of an owl. Around midnight, everything changed. It started as a low hum, like the sound of distant traffic. At first, I thought it might be coming from a highway, but the nearest road was over 15 miles away and separated by several mountain ridges. The hum grew louder and more complex. I began to distinguish individual sounds, car engines, honking horns, the rumble of trucks, even what sounded like a subway train. But layered underneath the traffic sounds were others. Children playing in a park, adults talking and laughing, music from car radios, the general buzz of urban activity. I grabbed my flashlight and recorder and followed the sounds deeper into the forest. The urban noises seemed to come from just ahead of me, always just beyond the reach of my light. As I moved toward them, they would shift position, maintaining the same tantalizing distance. After an hour of following the sounds, I realized I was no longer on any trail I recognized. The forest around me looked different. The trees were younger, the undergrowth thicker, and there were plants I didn't recognize mixed in with the familiar Pacific Northwest flora. That's when I saw the lights. Through the trees ahead, I could see the glow of electric lights. Not the focused beam of flashlights or the flickering of campfires, but the diffused glow of streetlights and building illumination. I moved closer, trying to understand what I was seeing. Through a gap in the trees, I glimpsed what appeared to be a city street. Not a Forest Service road or even a rural highway, but an actual urban street with sidewalks, streetlights, and parked cars. People were walking on the sidewalks, going about their evening activities as if it were perfectly normal to have a city in the middle of the wilderness. I tried to push through the trees to get closer, but no matter how I moved, the gap remained just out of reach. I could see the city clearly, could hear the sounds of urban life, but I couldn't access it. As I watched, a woman walked past under a streetlight, talking on a cell phone. She was dressed for cool weather, but not for hiking, wearing regular city clothes and walking as casually as if she were strolling through her own neighborhood. She looked directly at me and waved. I waved back, too shocked to do anything else. Then the lights began to fade and the sounds grew distant. Within minutes, I was standing alone in dark forest with no sign that a city had ever been there. My GPS showed that I was 3 miles from my campsite, in an area that should have been the middle of a designated wilderness zone. I made it back to camp as the sun was rising, exhausted and completely baffled by what I had experienced. I spent the morning reviewing my recordings and photographs, trying to find some objective evidence of what I had seen. The recordings captured the urban sounds clearly, but they were layered with forest sounds in a way that didn't make acoustic sense. The photographs showed normal forest, but with occasional anomalies, a street sign partially visible behind a tree, the corner of a building just at the edge of the frame. I radioed my supervisor, District Ranger Patricia Martinez, and requested a meeting to discuss my findings. Patricia had been with the Forest Service for 25 years and had worked in this district longer than anyone else. When I described my experiences, she listened without interruption, taking careful notes. "You're not the first ranger to report anomalies in that area," she said when I finished. "We've had similar accounts going back to the 1960s, but we don't publicize them." She opened a filing cabinet and pulled out a thick folder labeled Sector 7, Unusual Incidents. Every few years, someone, rangers, hikers, researchers, reports experiences in that area that don't match normal forest conditions. We investigate what we can, but we've never found explanations that fit within standard operational parameters. The folder contained decades of reports describing experiences similar to mine. Rangers had reported trails that existed only sometimes, clearings that appeared to be in multiple locations simultaneously, and sounds that didn't match the environment. One report from 1973 described an encounter with what the ranger called displaced geography, finding a section of desert complete with cacti and sand dunes in the middle of the Oregon forest. Another from 1989 documented discovering a frozen lake during summer, complete with ice fishing huts and people fishing through holes in the ice. "What's the official explanation?" I asked. "There isn't one," Patricia said. "Officially, these incidents are classified as cases of environmental disorientation, hikers and even rangers becoming confused due to fatigue, dehydration, or psychological stress." She closed the folder and looked at me seriously. "Unofficially, those of us who work closely with that area have developed some theories." Over the next hour, Patricia explained what Forest Service personnel had pieced together over decades of unusual incidents. The affected area seemed to be what she called a thin place, a location where the boundaries between different realities were less stable than normal. The forest itself was normal, but the space it occupied sometimes overlapped with other places, other times, possibly even other versions of reality. "We think it's related to the geology," she explained. "That area sits on a complex intersection of fault lines and underground water systems. Some people theorize that certain geological conditions can create instabilities in how space and time function." The incidents followed patterns. They were more common during specific weather conditions, particularly when atmospheric pressure changed rapidly. They occurred most frequently in spring and fall, during times when the forest was transitioning between seasons. Most importantly, the anomalies seemed to respond to attention and intention. Hikers who were focused on their destination and not particularly observant might pass through the area without noticing anything unusual. But people who were actively exploring or investigating were more likely to encounter the spatial distortions. "That's why we don't publicize these incidents," Patricia said. "If people knew about them, we'd have investigators and thrill seekers flooding the area, which could be dangerous for everyone involved." She assigned me to become the unofficial monitor for Sector 7, responsible for documenting and investigating anomalous incidents while ensuring the safety of hikers who might encounter them. Over the following months, I developed protocols for dealing with the spatial distortions. I learned to recognize the warning signs, subtle changes in the way shadows fell, the appearance of unfamiliar plants or geological features, sounds that didn't match the environment. I also learned how to help disoriented hikers. The key was to focus on concrete, verifiable landmarks and to use GPS coordinates rather than visual navigation. The anomalies seemed to affect perception more than actual physical location, so electronic navigation remained reliable even when visual landmarks shifted. Most hikers who encountered the distortions were only briefly confused. They might notice that the trail seemed different or that familiar landmarks appeared to be in the wrong places, but they could usually find their way back to marked paths without serious difficulty. A few, however, became more deeply affected by the anomalies. These were usually people who were naturally sensitive to environmental changes, artists, naturalists, people with synesthesia, or other perceptual differences. For them, the boundary distortions were more pronounced and more disorienting. I developed a protocol for helping these individuals that involved teaching them to recognize when they were experiencing anomalous conditions and providing them with techniques for navigating back to normal space. The most important lesson was not to fight the distortions or try to force the environment to make sense according to normal rules. The anomalies seemed to respond negatively to resistance, becoming more pronounced when people became frustrated or frightened. Instead, I taught hikers to accept what they were experiencing as a temporary condition and to focus on finding familiar reference points that could guide them back to normal trails. This approach worked well for most people, but I occasionally encountered individuals who became so fascinated by the anomalies that they didn't want to leave. These cases required more delicate handling. The distorted areas could be genuinely dangerous, not because of any malevolent force, but because normal safety protocols didn't apply. Someone could become lost in ways that made conventional search and rescue techniques ineffective. I had to develop new strategies for locating people who had become displaced within the anomalous zones, techniques that involved understanding the internal logic of the distorted spaces rather than trying to navigate them according to normal geographical principles. One of the most challenging cases involved a researcher named Dr. Sarah Kim, a geologist from the university who had come to study the area's unique geological features. Dr. Kim was naturally analytical and intensely curious about anything that didn't fit normal scientific models. When she encountered the spatial distortions, instead of becoming disoriented or frightened, she became fascinated. She spent 3 days mapping what she called impossible topography, areas where water flowed uphill, where magnetic compasses pointed in different directions depending on which way you were facing, where the same rock formation appeared to exist in multiple locations simultaneously. When she failed to return to her scheduled pickup point, I was called in to locate her. I found her 4 miles from where she should have been, in a clearing that contained what appeared to be a small town from the early 1900s. Complete with wooden buildings, dirt streets, and even a few people walking around in period clothing. Dr. Kim was sitting on the porch of what looked like a general store, taking detailed notes and interviewing the residents about their daily lives. "This is incredible," she told me when I found her. "It's a complete temporal displacement. This town existed here in 1907, but it was abandoned when the railroad changed routes. Somehow this area is allowing me to interact with it as it was over a century ago." The people she was talking to seemed as real as anyone, but they spoke about events and concerns from 1907 as if they were happening in the present day. I had to convince Dr. Kim to leave not because the situation was dangerous, but because prolonged exposure to the temporal distortions could make it increasingly difficult to return to normal time. "Time moves differently here," I explained. "You think you've been here for 3 days, but according to your watch and my GPS, you've been missing for a week." That got her attention. She looked at her watch, which showed the correct time, then looked around the historical town with new understanding. "If I stay much longer, I might not be able to get back to my own time period at all," she said. We navigated back to normal space using a technique I had developed of following the most recently disturbed trail markers. The anomalous areas seemed to retain the most recent version of official trail maintenance, even when everything else was displaced in time or space. Dr. Kim became one of my most valuable collaborators in understanding the phenomenon. She brought scientific methodology to the investigation, while I provided practical experience in navigating the distorted areas safely. Together, we developed a preliminary model of how the anomalies worked. The affected area seemed to exist in a state of quantum uncertainty, where multiple possible versions of the same space could exist simultaneously. Under normal conditions, observation collapsed these possibilities into a single, consistent reality. But certain environmental conditions, changes in atmospheric pressure, specific electromagnetic conditions related to the underground geology, perhaps even the mental state of the observer, could destabilize this process. When that happened, people could perceive and even interact with alternate versions of the space, versions where the forest had developed differently, where human settlements had followed different patterns, or where different time periods overlapped. "It's like the area is an intersection point for multiple parallel realities," Dr. Kim explained. "Most of the time, we experience only one version, but sometimes the barriers between them become permeable." This model helped explain why the anomalies followed the patterns they did. They were more common during weather changes because atmospheric pressure affected the geological conditions that created the instability. They were more noticeable to observant people because focused attention helped collapse the quantum uncertainty in ways that revealed the alternate realities. Understanding the mechanism made it easier to predict when anomalies were likely to occur and to help people navigate them safely when they did. But it also raised larger questions about the nature of reality and consciousness that went far beyond Forest Service protocols. I've been monitoring Sector 7 for over a year now, and I've documented dozens of incidents involving spatial and temporal distortions. Each one teaches me something new about the flexible nature of the space we inhabit. I've learned that reality is much less stable than most people assume. The forest shows me daily that our normal experience of consistent, linear time and fixed geography is just one possibility among many. Most importantly, I've learned that these anomalies aren't threats to be eliminated or problems to be solved. They're natural phenomena that require respect and understanding rather than fear. The forest is teaching anyone willing to listen that the boundaries between possible worlds are thinner than we imagine, and that paying attention to the spaces between ordinary experiences can reveal extraordinary truths. Hikers still report unusual experiences in Sector 7, but now I'm able to help them understand what they're encountering and navigate it safely. Some leave with fascinating stories and a broader understanding of what's possible in the natural world. Others, like Dr. Kim, become regular visitors, drawn back by the opportunity to explore realities that exist nowhere else. The forest continues to shift and change, revealing new possibilities with each season. And I continue to learn that being a ranger means not just protecting the wilderness as it is, but also protecting the wilderness as it could be, in all its infinite, impossible variations. Some places, it turns out, are too wild to be contained by a single version of reality. They require guardians who understand that the most important thing to preserve isn't just the trees and trails, but the sense of wonder that comes from discovering that the world is far stranger and more magnificent than we ever dared to imagine. Story 5: The Museum Night Guard. I never expected to find my calling as a security guard at the Metropolitan Museum of Natural History, but after 3 years on the night shift, I can't imagine working anywhere else. There's something magical about having an entire museum to yourself, walking through halls filled with millions of years of history while the rest of the city sleeps. The museum hired me straight out of college when my plans for graduate school fell through. I needed steady work and benefits, and they needed someone reliable for the midnight to 8 shift. It seemed like a temporary solution that would give me time to figure out what I really wanted to do with my life. 3 years later, I'm still here, and I've learned that some jobs choose you rather than the other way around. My supervisor, Marcus Thompson, had worked museum security for 15 years before being promoted to head of night operations. During my first week, he walked me through the protocols, hourly patrols through each wing, monitoring the security system and logging any unusual occurrences. The building is old, he told me as we walked through the dimly lit halls. Built in 1869 with additions every few decades since then. Old buildings make noise, settling foundations, temperature changes, the heating system cycling on and off. You'll get used to it. He paused in front of the dinosaur hall, where massive skeletons loomed in the emergency lighting. But sometimes, he continued, you'll notice things that don't quite fit the normal pattern. When that happens, just document it in your log and let me know. We've developed protocols over the years for unusual situations. I thought he was just preparing me for the isolation and weird acoustics of working alone in a vast building at night. For the first month, my shifts were exactly what I expected. I'd make my rounds, check doors and windows, monitor the alarm system, and spend quiet hours reading or studying between patrols. The building did make noise, but it was the predictable creaking and settling that Marcus had described. The exhibits were beautiful in the dim lighting. There's something peaceful about walking through the mineral hall at 3 a.m., past cases of glowing gems and crystals, or standing in the Hall of Human Origins surrounded by the story of our species' development. I began to understand why some of the veteran guards talked about the museum as if it were a living thing. During the day, it was filled with school groups and tourists, bustling with activity and conversation. At night, it felt contemplative, almost meditative. It was during my second month that I first noticed the anomalies. I was doing my 2 a.m. patrol through the Hall of Biodiversity when I heard something that didn't fit the normal nighttime sounds. Soft footsteps, too light and quick to be another guard, coming from the direction of the mammal dioramas. I followed the sound, my flashlight cutting through the darkness between the display cases. The footsteps seemed to stay just ahead of me, always around the next corner or behind the next exhibit. When I reached the African mammals section, the footsteps stopped. I stood quietly, listening for any indication of where the sounds had gone. The hall was silent except for the low hum of the climate control system. That's when I noticed that one of the dioramas had changed. The African savanna exhibit, which normally showed lions, zebras, and antelope in a realistic grassland setting, now included an animal I didn't recognize. It looked like a large cat, but with markings and proportions that didn't match any species I knew. I checked my handbook of museum exhibits, but there was no mention of this particular animal. According to the official documentation, the savanna diorama contained only the species I was familiar with. I took photos with my phone and made detailed notes in my security log, including the exact time and location of the observation. When I checked the same diorama on my next patrol 2 hours later, it had returned to normal. The mysterious animal was gone, and only the familiar African mammals remained. I reported the incident to Marcus the next evening. He read my notes carefully and examined the photos on my phone. The images clearly showed the unknown animal, but Marcus didn't seem surprised. Temporal fauna, he said matter-of-factly. We see it occasionally, usually in the natural history sections. Animals that existed in the past, or sometimes animals that might exist in possible futures, appearing temporarily in the dioramas. He opened a filing cabinet and pulled out a thick logbook. We've been documenting these appearances for over 40 years. Most common are extinct species showing up in their appropriate geographical regions, but sometimes we get animals that don't match any known species. I stared at the logbook, which contained hundreds of entries describing similar incidents. Guards had reported seeing saber-toothed cats in the North American Mammal Hall, giant ground sloths in the South American section, and various extinct birds in the ornithology displays. But how is that possible? I asked. Marcus sat back in his chair and considered the question. The museum houses specimens from across millions of years of natural history. Fossils, preserved remains, genetic material. We have pieces of life from every era of Earth's development. Some of us think that all this concentrated biological history creates a kind of temporal resonance. He gestured toward the museum floors above us. During the day, when the building is full of people and activity, everything stays locked in the present. But at night, when it's quiet and the barriers between past and present become thinner, sometimes the exhibits remember what they used to be. Over the following weeks, I began to pay closer attention to subtle changes in the exhibits during my nightly rounds. It started with small things, a fossil skeleton that seemed to have shifted positions slightly between patrols, a mineral display where the lighting appeared different, making the specimens seem to glow with an inner fire, cases in the Hall of Human Evolution where the ancient tools looked like they had been recently used rather than sitting untouched for thousands of years. But gradually, I began to notice more dramatic changes. One night I was walking through the Hall of Ocean Life when I heard the sound of water, not dripping or flowing, but the rhythmic sound of waves lapping against a shore. The sound was coming from the whale exhibit, where a massive blue whale model hung suspended from the ceiling. As I approached, I could smell salt air and feel a subtle humidity that shouldn't have been possible in the climate-controlled environment. Looking up at the whale model, I saw something that took my breath away. The static display had become a living scene. The whale was moving, its massive body undulating through what appeared to be actual water rather than empty air. Smaller marine life swam around it, dolphins, schools of fish, even what looked like prehistoric marine reptiles. I stood there for nearly 20 minutes, watching an ancient ocean ecosystem play out above my head. The whale's song echoed through the hall, a deep, haunting sound that seemed to come from the very beginning of life on Earth. When I returned an hour later, everything had returned to normal. The whale hung motionless from its cables, and the hall smelled only of the usual museum scents of cleaning products and old wood. But for those 20 minutes, I had witnessed the ocean as it had been millions of years ago, teeming with life that existed now only in fossil records and displays. Marcus nodded when I described the experience. The marine hall is particularly active, he said. Water has memory, they say. Maybe that's why the ocean exhibits are so prone to temporal manifestations. He showed me entries in the logbook describing similar experiences. Guards had reported seeing living coral reefs in the marine geology section, schools of extinct fish swimming through the air, and even what appeared to be early whales with legs walking along prehistoric coastlines. The key, Marcus explained, is to observe without trying to interfere. These manifestations seem to be fragile. If you try to interact with them or document them too aggressively, they fade quickly. I learned to move quietly during these encounters, to watch with respect rather than scientific detachment. The museum was sharing its deepest memories with me, and I began to understand that my role was less security guard and more witness to natural history. The most remarkable experience came during my 6th month on the job. I was doing my midnight patrol through the dinosaur hall when I noticed that the lighting had changed. Instead of the usual emergency lighting that provided just enough illumination for navigation, the hall was filled with a warm, golden light that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The massive skeletons were no longer static displays. They moved with fluid grace through what appeared to be their natural environment. The Tyrannosaurus rex stalked between tropical ferns that had somehow grown up from the museum floor. Triceratops grazed peacefully in herds, while smaller dinosaurs darted between the legs of the giants. The air was warm and humid, filled with the sounds of a living ecosystem: bird calls, rustling vegetation, the distant sound of water, and the various vocalizations of dinosaurs that science could only guess at. I found myself standing in the middle of a Mesozoic forest, surrounded by creatures that had been extinct for 65 million years. They paid no attention to me, going about their daily activities as if I were just another part of their environment. A small, feathered dinosaur about the size of a chicken approached me cautiously. It tilted its head, studying me with bright, intelligent eyes, before chirping softly and returning to its search for food among the ferns. I realized I was witnessing not just individual species, but an entire ecosystem in action. Predators and prey, plants and animals, all interconnected in the complex web of relationships that had sustained life on Earth for millions of years. The vision lasted for over an hour. I walked carefully through the prehistoric landscape, observing behaviors and interactions that no human had ever seen. It was like being given a window into Earth's deep past, a chance to understand how life had really functioned in an era that existed now only in fossil fragments and scientific speculation. When the experience finally faded, I found myself alone again among the familiar skeleton displays, but something had fundamentally changed in how I understood my work. I wasn't just guarding exhibits, I was protecting a repository of life's entire history on Earth, a place where the boundaries between past and present were thin enough that the ancient world could occasionally break through into our time. Marcus listened to my account with the attention of someone who had heard similar stories many times before. "The Dinosaur Hall is special," he said. "It's the most popular exhibit during the day, which means it absorbs the most human attention and emotion. Children especially seem to leave an imprint of wonder and excitement that somehow feeds into the temporal manifestations." He explained that the night guards had developed an informal theory about how the phenomena worked. The combination of intense public interest during the day and the quiet, meditative atmosphere at night created conditions where the exhibits could remember their original states. "Museums are places where time gets compressed," he said. "We display millions of years of history in spaces you can walk through in minutes. Sometimes that compression becomes unstable, and different time periods bleed through into each other." Over my remaining months as a night guard, I documented dozens of these temporal episodes. I saw living versions of every major exhibit in the museum: ancient forests growing in the paleobotany section, early humans gathering around fires in the anthropology wing, even space environments in the planetarium where I could see the formation of solar systems and the birth of stars. Each experience taught me something new about the continuity of life and the deep connections between past and present. The museum wasn't just displaying natural history, it was somehow preserving the actual experiences of life across geological time. I began to understand why veteran guards talked about the museum with such reverence. We weren't just employees, we were custodians of life's memory, protectors of the thin places where the past could speak to the present. When my 3-year anniversary arrived, I was offered a promotion to day shift supervisor. It would have meant better pay, regular hours, and the chance to work with people instead of spending my nights alone with the exhibits. I turned it down without hesitation. Some people are meant to witness the quiet miracles that happen when the world thinks no one is watching. I had found my calling in the spaces between day and night, between past and present, between the static displays of museum exhibits and the living history they represented. I still work the night shift at the Metropolitan Museum of Natural History. I still make my hourly rounds, monitor the security system, and document unusual occurrences in my log. But now I understand that my real job is something much more important than building security. I'm a guardian of time itself, protecting the moments when the ancient world reaches across millions of years to remind us that life is continuous, that we're part of a story that began long before humans existed and will continue long after we're gone. The museum keeps its deepest secrets for those who are willing to spend their nights in service to something larger than themselves. And sometimes, if you're very quiet and very patient, those secrets will reveal themselves in ways that change how you understand everything about life, time, and the miraculous continuity of existence on Earth. The night shift isn't just a job, it's a privilege. Not everyone gets to stand guard over the memories of the world. Story 6: The Radio Station Engineer. I've been a broadcast engineer for 8 years, but nothing in my training prepared me for working at KPNW, the small public radio station tucked away in the hills outside Portland. The station has been broadcasting since 1952, and the building itself dates back to the 1940s when it served as a communication hub for the local military base. When I took the job last year, I thought I'd be dealing with typical small station problems: aging equipment, limited budget, and the challenge of keeping vintage transmitters running on modern technology. What I discovered was that some radio stations pick up more than just the signals they're designed to receive. My predecessor, Tom Rodriguez, had worked at KPNW for 12 years before retiring. During my first week, he walked me through the equipment and procedures with the thoroughness of someone who genuinely cared about the station's continued operation. The transmitter is temperamental, he told me as we stood in the main broadcast room, surrounded by racks of equipment that ranged from cutting-edge digital processors to vacuum tube amplifiers from the 1960s. But it's reliable if you treat it right. The key is understanding that this building has its own personality. He paused, adjusting a control on the mixing board with the practiced touch of someone who knew every piece of equipment intimately. You'll probably notice some unusual signal phenomena, he continued. Atmospheric conditions in this area can cause interesting reception patterns. Sometimes you'll pick up stations that shouldn't be reachable from here, voices speaking languages that don't quite match any you recognize, even music that sounds like it's from different eras. Tom showed me the station logs, which contain decades of entries documenting strange signal incidents. Most were attributed to atmospheric propagation, the way radio waves can bounce off the ionosphere and travel much farther than normal under certain conditions. But sometimes, Tom said quietly, you'll receive signals that don't seem to be coming from anywhere in particular. When that happens, just document it and keep the station running normally. We've never had any interference with our regular programming. I thought he was just describing the quirks of working with older equipment in a building that had been handling radio communications for over 70 years. For the first month, my work was exactly what I expected. I maintained the transmitter, updated the digital systems, and kept the station broadcasting 24 hours a day. KPNW played an eclectic mix of music, news, and local programming that served the rural communities scattered throughout the region. The building was peaceful during my evening shifts. Most of the programming was automated after 10 p.m., which meant I could focus on equipment maintenance and system monitoring, while the station continued broadcasting to night shift workers, insomniacs, and long-distance truckers driving through the mountains. It was during my second month that I first encountered what Tom had called unusual signal phenomena. I was running routine tests on the receiving equipment when I picked up a signal that didn't match anything in the area frequency guide. It was broadcasting on a frequency that should have been empty, using an AM signal with unusual characteristics. The content was what really caught my attention. It was a news program, but the stories being reported didn't match current events. The announcer, speaking in the clear, precise diction of 1940s radio, was discussing war rationing, victory gardens, and troop movements that sounded like they were from World War II. But the program wasn't a historical recreation or educational broadcast. The announcer spoke about events as if they were happening in real time, with the urgency and immediacy of live news reporting. I listened for nearly an hour as the program covered stories about local communities dealing with wartime shortages, families waiting for news from overseas, and civilian defense preparations. The level of detail was extraordinary: specific street addresses, names of local businesses that had closed decades ago, even weather reports for the region from what appeared to be 1943. When I tried to trace the signal's origin using our directional antenna array, I couldn't locate a source. The signal seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere, as if it were being broadcast from within the radio spectrum itself, rather than from a physical transmitter. I documented the incident in the station log and mentioned it to Tom when he came in the next day to help with some equipment updates. He nodded knowingly. Temporal broadcast phenomena, he said. We've been receiving those signals sporadically for decades. always from the past, usually from the 1940s through the 1960s, always related to this local area. He showed me older entries in the station logs that described similar experiences. Engineers had reported receiving radio dramas that had aired once in the 1950s and never been repeated, local news programs from the 1960s discussing events that had long since been forgotten, even what appeared to be private radio conversations between ham operators who had died years earlier. The prevailing theory, Tom explained, is that radio waves don't always dissipate the way we think they do. Under certain atmospheric and electromagnetic conditions, signals that were broadcast decades ago can somehow become accessible again. He gestured toward the hills that surrounded the station. This area has unusual geology, lots of quartz deposits and mineral formations that can affect electromagnetic propagation. Some people think that combination of geological and atmospheric factors can create pockets where old radio signals get preserved and occasionally replay. Over the following weeks, I began to pay closer attention to the anomalous signals that the station equipment occasionally picked up. The temporal broadcasts followed patterns. They were most common during specific weather conditions, particularly when atmospheric pressure was changing rapidly or during electrical storms. They seemed to be triggered by certain equipment configurations, particularly when I was using the older vacuum tube receivers for testing purposes. Most intriguingly, the content of these broadcasts was always historically accurate. When I researched the events and people mentioned in the temporal news programs, I found that they matched historical records perfectly, often including details that weren't widely known or documented. One particularly remarkable episode occurred during a late autumn evening when I was conducting routine maintenance on the station's main receiver. I was testing signal reception across different frequency bands when I picked up what sounded like a live music performance. The audio quality had the warm, rich characteristics of 1940s recording technology, and the music was big band jazz with a full orchestra and vocalists. But this wasn't a recording. I could hear the subtle ambient sounds of a live performance, audience conversations between songs, the clink of glasses, even what sounded like requests being called out to the band. The announcer, speaking between musical numbers, identified the location as the Riverside Ballroom and mentioned that the performance was being broadcast live on KPNW. But the Riverside Ballroom had been demolished in 1967, and KPNW had never broadcast live music performances from external venues. I listened to the entire performance, which lasted nearly 3 hours. The music was exceptional, professional quality performances of standards from the 1940s with arrangements that I had never heard on any commercial recordings. During an intermission, the announcer conducted brief interviews with audience members. They spoke about wartime experiences, local community events, and personal stories that painted a vivid picture of life in the region during the 1940s. What struck me most was the authenticity of the experience. This wasn't a recreation or a period piece. It was somehow an actual live performance from 75 years ago, preserved in the electromagnetic spectrum and occasionally accessible under the right conditions. When I researched the Riverside Ballroom, I found newspaper advertisements from 1943 that mentioned a special live radio broadcast featuring exactly the performers and music I had heard. I began to realize that I wasn't just receiving random temporal signals. I was somehow accessing specific broadcasts that had originated from KPNW itself decades earlier. This discovery led me to research the station's history more thoroughly. I spent hours in the local historical society, looking through old newspapers, station records, and community archives. What I found was that KPNW had played a much more significant role in the local community during the 1940s and 1950s than I had realized. The station had been a central communication hub during World War II, broadcasting not just entertainment and news, but also emergency information, community announcements, and even personal messages for families separated by the war. The station had also served as a gathering place for the community. Live performances, town meetings, and social events had all been broadcast from the KPNW studios, creating a rich archive of local history that existed only in the electromagnetic echoes that occasionally surfaced in the present day. Armed with this historical context, I began to understand the temporal broadcasts differently. They weren't random signals from the past, they were the station's own memories, preserved in the building's equipment and infrastructure, and occasionally accessible when conditions were right. This realization changed how I approached my work at KPNW. I began to see myself not just as an engineer maintaining current broadcasting equipment, but as a caretaker of the station's entire history. I started keeping more detailed logs of the temporal broadcasts, documenting not just their technical characteristics, but also their historical content. I researched the people and events mentioned in the old programs, creating a database of local history that was more comprehensive than anything in the official archives. The temporal signals became a regular part of my routine. I learned to recognize the electromagnetic conditions that made them more likely to occur and began scheduling my maintenance work to take advantage of these opportunities. Some evenings, I would deliberately tune the receivers to search for temporal broadcasts, using the station's equipment to explore different periods of local history. It was like having access to a vast audio archive that existed nowhere except in the electromagnetic memory of the region. The most profound experience came during my 6th month at KPNW. I was working late on a particularly clear night when I picked up a signal that seemed different from the usual temporal broadcasts. Instead of a complete program, it was fragments of conversations, brief exchanges between radio operators that seemed to span multiple decades. As I listened more carefully, I realized that I was hearing conversations between different generations of KPNW engineers. I could distinguish Tom's voice from earlier in his career, along with voices of engineers who had worked at the station before him. They were discussing technical problems, equipment upgrades, and the quirks of working with the station's vintage broadcasting gear. But layered underneath these practical conversations were more personal exchanges, engineers sharing their experiences with the temporal broadcast phenomena, discussing theories about what caused them, and even leaving messages for future engineers who might encounter similar signals. That's when I heard my own voice. It was a conversation that hadn't happened yet, discussing equipment problems that I had just begun to notice and mentioning temporal broadcasts that I had recently documented. But somehow, my future self was talking with engineers from the past about shared experiences across decades of working at KPNW. I realized that the temporal broadcasts weren't just one-way communications from the past. They were part of an ongoing conversation that spanned the entire history of the station, connecting every engineer who had ever worked there in a dialogue that transcended normal linear time. Understanding this, I began to actively participate in the temporal communications. During periods when the conditions were right for receiving temporal signals, I would broadcast my own messages, sharing information about current equipment status, documenting solutions to technical problems, and leaving guidance for future engineers who might encounter similar challenges. I discovered that these messages could somehow reach both the past and the future. Engineers from earlier decades would respond to technical questions I hadn't yet asked, while I could provide solutions to problems that had puzzled my predecessors. The station became a temporal collaboration, where the accumulated knowledge and experience of everyone who had ever worked there was available to help maintain the equipment and preserve the station's mission of serving the community. This wasn't just about radio technology. It was about the continuity of purpose that connected all of us who had chosen to dedicate our careers to keeping this small station broadcasting. Tom visited the station occasionally during my first year, and I shared some of my experiences with the temporal broadcasts. He smiled and nodded, clearly recognizing phenomena he had dealt with for years. The station chooses its engineers carefully, he told me. Not everyone who works here experiences the temporal communications, but those who do tend to stay for a long time. There's something addictive about being part of a conversation that spans decades. He was right, working at KPNW had become much more than a job. I was part of a community that existed across time, connected by shared purpose and the strange electromagnetic properties of this particular location. The temporal broadcasts taught me that some forms of communication transcend the normal boundaries of time and space. Radio waves, once transmitted, don't simply disappear, they become part of the electromagnetic environment, occasionally accessible under the right conditions. But more than that, they showed me that dedication and purpose can create connections that persist long after the people involved have moved on. Every engineer who had ever worked at KPNW was somehow still present in the station's equipment and infrastructure, their knowledge and experience available to help maintain the continuity of service. I still work at KPNW, and I still receive temporal broadcasts on a regular basis. Each one teaches me something new about the station's history, the local community, or the technical challenges of maintaining vintage broadcasting equipment. But the most important thing I've learned is that some jobs are really callings that extend far beyond normal employment. Working at KPNW means becoming part of a tradition that connects the past, present, and future in service of something larger than any individual contribution. The voices from the past remind me that the work we do today will echo through time, affecting people we'll never meet and solving problems we can't yet imagine. And someday, my voice will be part of that temporal conversation, helping future engineers navigate challenges that haven't yet been invented, sharing solutions discovered through decades of careful attention to both the technical and mysterious aspects of keeping a small radio station broadcasting. The electromagnetic spectrum remembers everything. Those of us who work in radio are just temporary custodians of conversations that began before we arrived and will continue long after we're gone. That's the real magic of working at a station like KPNW, discovering that some forms of communication are truly timeless. Story 7: The Hospital Night Nurse. I've been a registered nurse for 10 years, but nothing prepared me for working the night shift at St. Catherine's Memorial Hospital. The hospital has been serving our community since 1923, and while the medical technology has been updated countless times, the building itself retains the character and quirks of nearly a century of healing. When I transferred to the night shift last year, I thought the biggest challenge would be adjusting my sleep schedule and dealing with the reduced staffing that comes with overnight hours. What I discovered was that hospitals at night operate according to different rules than during the day, and some of those rules have nothing to do with modern medicine. My supervisor, Margaret Chen, had been working nights at St. Catherine's for 18 years. During my orientation, she walked me through the protocols with the thoroughness of someone who understood that night nursing required skills beyond what they taught in school. The building has personality, she told me as we made rounds through the quiet corridors. During the day, it's all business, doctors, procedures, families coming and going. But at night, when things settle down, you become more aware of the hospital's history. She paused outside room 314, which was currently empty but scheduled to receive a patient the next day. You'll notice things, Margaret continued. Sounds that don't match current activity, glimpses of people in areas that should be vacant, sometimes even the feeling that you're being helped by someone who isn't officially on the schedule. She opened the door to 314 and showed me the room's features, the call button, medical gas outlets, emergency equipment. It looked like every other patient room in the hospital. This room has interesting activity, she said matter-of-factly. Patients recover faster here than statistical averages would predict. They sleep better, need less pain medication, and generally report feeling more comfortable and cared for. Margaret closed the door and continued down the hallway. We've never found a medical explanation for it, but we've learned to use room 314 for patients who need extra support, people facing difficult diagnoses, elderly patients who are confused or frightened, anyone who seems to be struggling with the hospital environment. I thought she was describing the kind of superstitions that develop in any workplace where people deal with life and death situations regularly. For the first month, my shifts were exactly what I expected from night nursing. I administered medications, monitored patients, documented changes in condition, and provided comfort care for people who couldn't sleep or were dealing with pain and anxiety. Night shifts have a different rhythm than day shifts. There are fewer interruptions, more time to really talk with patients, and a quieter atmosphere that allows for the kind of careful observation that can catch problems before they become emergencies. I began to appreciate the way experienced night nurses seemed to anticipate patient needs before they were expressed. They would check on certain patients more frequently, adjust comfort measures before patients complained, and somehow always appear in rooms just when they were most needed. I assumed this was just the result of years of experience and finely tuned clinical intuition. It was during my second month that I first encountered what Margaret had called the hospital's personality. I was checking on Mrs. Patterson, an elderly woman recovering from pneumonia in room 318. She had been restless and anxious since her admission, having difficulty sleeping despite medications and struggling with the unfamiliar hospital environment. As I entered her room to check her vital signs, I noticed that someone had already been there. Mrs. Patterson was sleeping peacefully, her breathing relaxed and regular. Her water glass had been refilled, her blanket straightened, and the room had been dimmed to a comfortable level for rest. But according to the nursing log, no one had been in her room since my colleague Jennifer had administered medications 2 hours earlier. I checked with Jennifer, thinking perhaps she had returned to the room and forgotten to document it. "I haven't been back to 318, she told me. but that's good that Mrs. Patterson is sleeping. She's been having such a hard time settling in. I returned to Mrs. Patterson's room to complete my assessment. As I quietly took her pulse, she stirred slightly and smiled. "Thank you for earlier," she whispered. "The lady who came in was so kind. She helped me get comfortable and told me not to worry, that everything would be all right." I assumed Mrs. Patterson was confused or had been dreaming, but when I checked her chart, I found a note that hadn't been there earlier, written in handwriting I didn't recognize. "Patient assisted with comfort positioning and reassurance. Sleeping well, no immediate needs." The note was signed E. Morrison, RN, but there was no nurse by that name on our current staff. I brought the chart to Margaret, who examined the note with interest but no surprise. "Eleanor Morrison," she said after a moment. "She worked here from 1945 to 1978. Wonderful nurse, especially with elderly patients and people who were frightened or confused." Margaret opened a filing cabinet and pulled out a thick folder containing what appeared to be personnel records from previous decades. "Eleanor died in 1982, she continued, "but patients still report interactions with a kind nurse who matches her description. Always in situations where someone needs extra comfort and reassurance." She showed me a photograph from the hospital's 1970 staff directory. The woman in the picture had the gentle face and confident bearing of an experienced nurse, someone who had dedicated her career to caring for others. "We've documented dozens of encounters over the years," Margaret explained. "Patients report being helped by nurses who don't match any current staff descriptions. The interactions are always beneficial. People sleep better, recover faster, feel less anxious about their medical care." She returned the folder to the filing cabinet and looked at me seriously. "The question is whether you can work comfortably with this kind of assistance. Some nurses find it unsettling and request transfers. Others come to appreciate the extra support." Over the following weeks, I began to notice signs of these mysterious helpers throughout my shifts. Patients in difficult situations would report conversations with nurses who had provided comfort and information, but whose descriptions didn't match anyone on the current staff. Equipment would be prepared in advance for procedures that hadn't yet been scheduled. Rooms would be arranged in ways that improved patient comfort, even though no one had documented making these changes. Most remarkably, I began to find clinical notes written in old-fashioned handwriting, always providing accurate information about patient status and care needs. The notes were signed with names that appeared in the hospital's historical records but not on current staff rosters. The ghost nurses, as I came to think of them, seemed to focus on the aspects of patient care that modern medicine sometimes overlooked: emotional support, comfort measures, and the kind of unhurried attention that helped people feel cared for as individuals rather than just medical cases. One particularly memorable encounter occurred during my third month on the night shift. I was caring for Mr. Davidson, a middle-aged man who had been admitted with chest pain. His cardiac tests had come back normal, but he remained anxious and convinced that something serious was wrong with his heart. Despite reassurances from his doctors and nursing staff, Mr. Davidson couldn't relax. He was calling for assistance frequently, checking his pulse constantly, and working himself into a state of panic that was actually affecting his physical condition. I had spent considerable time with him during my shift, providing reassurance and teaching him relaxation techniques, but nothing seemed to help. Around 3 a.m., I received a call from Mr. Davidson's room. When I answered, he sounded completely different, calm and peaceful. "I just wanted to thank you for sending that experienced nurse," he said. "She explained everything so clearly and helped me understand that anxiety was making my symptoms worse. I feel much better now." I hadn't sent anyone to his room, but when I checked on him, I found Mr. Davidson sleeping peacefully for the first time since his admission. On his bedside table was a handwritten note explaining the relationship between anxiety and physical symptoms, written in language that was both medically accurate and easy for a patient to understand. The note was signed Catherine Walsh, RN, 1952-1987. I researched Catherine Walsh in the hospital's historical records and found that she had been known for her exceptional ability to calm anxious patients and explain medical concepts in ways that reduced fear and promoted healing. Mr. Davidson's recovery progressed rapidly after that night. His anxiety decreased, his physical symptoms resolved, and he was discharged 2 days later with a much better understanding of how to manage stress-related health concerns. This pattern repeated regularly throughout my tenure on the night shift. The ghost nurses seemed to appear whenever patients needed the kind of care that required time, patience, and emotional intelligence, qualities that modern nursing values but doesn't always have the resources to provide adequately. I began to understand that I wasn't just working alongside my living colleagues, but with generations of nurses who had dedicated their careers to caring for patients at St. Catherine's. Their knowledge and experience somehow remained available to help with challenging situations. Margaret confirmed this understanding when I shared my experiences with her. Nursing is one of those professions where the commitment extends beyond employment, she explained. When you dedicate your life to healing and caring for others, that dedication doesn't end when you retire or even when you die. She showed me more historical records, including letters from families thanking nurses for exceptional care, commendations for clinical excellence, and documentation of innovative care practices that had been developed by St. Catherine's nursing staff over the decades. These nurses loved their work and were exceptionally good at it, Margaret said. I think they remain connected to the hospital because their sense of purpose was so strong. They continue to care for patients because that's who they were at the deepest level. Learning to work with the ghost nurses required developing new skills beyond what I had learned in nursing school. I had to become more observant of subtle environmental changes, more sensitive to patient needs that might not be expressed directly, and more open to receiving assistance from sources I couldn't always see or explain. The ghost nurses taught me that excellent patient care involves much more than following protocols and administering treatments. It requires understanding each patient as a complete person, addressing emotional and spiritual needs alongside physical symptoms, and creating an environment where healing can occur on multiple levels. Most importantly, they showed me that nursing is a collaborative profession that extends across time. Every nurse who had ever worked at St. Catherine's had contributed to a collective knowledge base that remained available to help current staff provide the best possible care. One of the most touching encounters occurred during my 6th month on the night shift. I was caring for Sarah, a young mother who had been admitted for complications during pregnancy. She was frightened and lonely, separated from her family by distance and visiting restrictions, and worried about both her own health and her baby's well-being. Sarah had been having difficulty sleeping and was becoming increasingly anxious about her condition. I had provided as much emotional support as time allowed, but she continued to struggle with fear and isolation. During one particularly difficult night, I found Sarah crying quietly in her room. When I asked what was wrong, she told me about a dream she'd had. There was a nurse here, she said, an older woman with kind eyes. She sat with me and told me about all the babies who had been born safely at this hospital, even when there were complications. She said the hospital has a long tradition of protecting mothers and babies, and that I was surrounded by people who understood what I was going through. Sarah's mood had improved dramatically after this dream. She seemed calmer, more confident about her treatment, and more able to rest effectively. The next morning, I found a small gift on Sarah's bedside table, a hand-knitted baby blanket in soft yellow yarn. There was no note, no indication of where it had come from, but the blanket was clearly handmade with expert skill and loving attention. When I asked Sarah about it, she said she had found it when she woke up, along with a feeling that someone was watching over her and her baby. Sarah's pregnancy progressed well, and she delivered a healthy baby boy 3 weeks later. She kept the mysterious blanket, and whenever she brought her son for follow-up appointments, she would tell other expectant mothers about the angel nurse who had helped her through her difficult time. These interactions taught me that healing involves much more than medical interventions. Patients need to feel connected, supported, and cared for as complete human beings. The ghost nurses provided this kind of holistic care, addressing needs that couldn't be met with medications or procedures. Working with them also taught me about the continuity of nursing practice. Each generation of nurses builds on the knowledge and traditions of those who came before, contributing to an evolving understanding of how to promote healing and provide comfort. The ghost nurses represented the accumulated wisdom of nearly a century of nursing practice at St. Catherine's. They had developed techniques for patient care that remained effective across generations, and they continued to share this knowledge with current staff through their ongoing presence in the hospital. I've been working the night shift at St. Catherine's for over a year now, and I continue to receive assistance from the nurses who came before me. Each encounter teaches me something new about patient care, clinical observation, or the art of providing comfort in difficult situations. But the most important lesson I've learned is that nursing is fundamentally about human connection. The technical skills are important, but what really promotes healing is the sense that someone genuinely cares about your well-being and will stay with you through difficult times. The ghost nurses embody this principle perfectly. They continue to care for patients because caring was the essence of who they were as people, not just what they did as employees. Modern nursing often feels rushed and task-oriented, focused on efficiency and documentation rather than relationship and comfort. Working alongside the ghost nurses reminds me daily that the most important aspects of nursing care can't be measured or documented. They exist in the quiet moments of human connection that happen between tasks. I still work the night shift at St. Catherine's Memorial Hospital, and I still receive help from nurses whose names appear only in historical records. They continue to teach me that the best nursing care happens when you treat each patient as if they were your own family member, deserving of patience, kindness, and the full attention of someone who genuinely wants to help. Some traditions in healthcare transcend individual careers or even individual lifetimes. The commitment to healing and caring for others creates bonds that persist long after the people involved have moved on to whatever comes next. Working at St. Catherine's has taught me that when you dedicate your life to serving others, that service becomes part of your essential identity, something that continues to find expression even beyond the normal boundaries of employment or existence. The night shift at the hospital isn't just about providing medical care during off hours. It's about maintaining a tradition of compassionate nursing that extends back nearly a century and will hopefully continue for many generations to come. Some forms of caring I've learned are truly timeless. Story 8: The Clock Repair Shop Owner. I inherited Pendleton's clock repair from my grandfather when I was 25, along with a building full of timepieces that hadn't run properly in decades and a reputation for fixing the unfixable. What I didn't inherit was an explanation for why every clock in the shop chimed at exactly 3:17 a.m., regardless of what time they were actually set to display. The shop had been in our family since 1952, tucked into a narrow storefront on Elm Street between a used bookstore and a vintage clothing boutique. The building itself dated back to the 1890s and had housed various businesses over the years, but it had been Pendleton's for as long as anyone in town could remember. My grandfather, Thomas Pendleton, had been the kind of craftsman who could coax life back into mechanisms that other repair shops had given up on. People brought him antique clocks, broken family heirlooms, and timepieces that had been gathering dust in attics for generations. Somehow he always managed to get them running again. When Thomas passed away last spring, he left me not just the business, but also a workshop filled with hundreds of clocks in various stages of repair. Some had been there for years, their owners long since moved away or forgotten. Others arrived weekly from people who had heard that Pendleton's was the place to go when time itself seemed broken. I had learned the basics of clock repair from my grandfather during summer visits as a teenager, but running the shop full-time was a completely different challenge. Each timepiece required individual attention, specialized tools, and an understanding of mechanisms that ranged from simple wind-up movements to complex astronomical displays. The mysterious 3:17 a.m. chiming started during my second week of full-time operation. I had been staying late to catch up on repairs, working on a Victorian mantel clock that hadn't run since the 1960s. The shop was quiet except for the usual symphony of ticking that provided a constant background rhythm during business hours. At exactly 3:17 a.m., every clock in the shop began to chime. Not just the clocks that were working, all of them. Grandfather clocks that hadn't run in decades, mantel clocks missing crucial parts, even digital clocks that weren't connected to power sources. They all marked 3:17 with their individual voices, deep bongs, delicate chimes, cuckoo calls, and musical melodies. The synchronized chiming lasted for exactly 1 minute, then stopped as abruptly as it had begun. I checked my phone to confirm the time. It was 3:17 a.m. The next morning I examined every clock in the shop, looking for some explanation. Most showed different times on their faces. Some had stopped years ago, others displayed random hours that bore no relationship to actual time. But they had all chimed together at 3:17. I mentioned the incident to my neighbor, Sarah Chen, who owned the bookstore next door. "Oh, that's been happening for years," she said matter-of-factly. "Your grandfather never seemed concerned about it. Sometimes I'd be working late and hear all the clocks going off at once. It's actually quite beautiful if you're not startled by it." She paused, organizing a display of vintage novels in her front window. "There was one night I was here really late, maybe 2 years ago, and I saw your grandfather in the shop during the chiming. But the strange thing was he was talking to someone I couldn't see, having a full conversation, gesturing toward different clocks, even laughing occasionally. When I asked him about it the next day, he just said the shop had good company at night." That evening I decided to stay and observe the 3:17 chiming more carefully. I positioned myself in the center of the workshop, surrounded by timepieces of every description. Grandfather clocks lined the walls, their cases ranging from simple oak to elaborate carved mahogany. Workbenches held dozens of smaller clocks, mantelpieces, alarm clocks, anniversary clocks with rotating pendulums, and delicate carriage clocks with intricate brass movements. As 3:17 approached, I could feel a change in the atmosphere. The normal ticking sounds seemed to synchronize, creating a unified rhythm that grew stronger as the moment approached. Then, at exactly 3:17, the chiming began, but this time I noticed something I had missed before. The chimes weren't random or chaotic, they were harmonized, creating a complex musical composition that seemed to tell a story through sound. As I listened more carefully, I began to distinguish individual voices within the chorus. Some clocks chimed with deep, authoritative tones that seemed to lead the melody. Others provided delicate accompaniment, while still others added rhythmic punctuation to the overall composition. It was beautiful and it was clearly intentional. When the chiming stopped, I heard something else. The sound of footsteps moving through the shop, accompanied by quiet conversation. "That was lovely tonight," a woman's voice said. The new mantel clock added such a nice counterpoint to the arrangement. "Yes," replied a man's voice that sounded familiar, though I couldn't place it. Each timepiece brings its own character to the ensemble. It's never quite the same twice. I looked around the shop, but I was alone among the silent clocks. The next day, I began researching the history of the building and the previous businesses that had operated there. What I found at the City Historical Society provided some intriguing context. Before becoming Pendleton's Clock Repair, the building had housed Harmony Music Academy from 1923 to 1951. The academy had been a beloved local institution, offering music lessons and hosting small concerts for the community. The academy had closed suddenly in 1951 when its founder, Margaret Harmony, died unexpectedly at the age of 58. According to newspaper accounts, Margaret had been a gifted musician and teacher who had dedicated her life to sharing music with others. Most interesting was a detail I found in Margaret's obituary. She had died at 3:17 a.m. on a spring morning in 1951, found at the Academy's piano where she had apparently been composing late into the night. The timing couldn't be coincidental. I decided to research Margaret Harmony more thoroughly, visiting the local library and talking to longtime residents who might remember the Music Academy. What I learned painted a picture of someone remarkably similar to my grandfather. Margaret had been known for her ability to bring out the musical potential in even the most challenging students. She had a gift for understanding the unique voice of each instrument and helping people find their own musical expression. Like my grandfather with his clocks, Margaret had believed that every musical instrument had its own personality and story to tell. Mrs. Alina Rodriguez, who had taken piano lessons at the academy as a child, shared her memories when I interviewed her at the senior center. Miss Harmony always said that music was about more than just playing notes correctly, Mrs. Rodriguez recalled. She taught us that instruments have souls, and that making music was really about having a conversation between souls. She smiled at the memory. She used to stay late at the academy, working with students who were struggling or just experimenting with new arrangements. Sometimes we'd walk by at night and hear the most beautiful music coming from the building, not just piano, but what sounded like a whole orchestra. Mrs. Rodriguez paused, looking thoughtful. But there were only a few instruments at the academy. Miss Harmony said that when musicians really understood their instruments, they could make one piano sound like an entire symphony. The parallels between Margaret's work with musical instruments and my grandfather's work with timepieces were striking. Both had been dedicated to understanding the individual character of mechanical devices and helping them express their full potential. Armed with this information, I began to approach the 3:17 chiming differently. Instead of trying to stop it or understand it mechanically, I started listening to it as a musical composition. Over the following weeks, I noticed that the nightly chiming varied subtly from day to day. Sometimes it was more melodic, other times more rhythmic. Occasionally, it built to dramatic crescendos before settling into peaceful conclusions. I also began to notice that the chiming seemed to respond to the work I did during the day. When I successfully repaired a clock that had been silent for years, that clock would take a more prominent role in the evening's composition. If I struggled with a particularly challenging repair, the chiming that night would be more supportive and encouraging. It was as if the clocks themselves, guided by some unseen conductor, were commenting on the day's work and offering encouragement for tomorrow's challenges. One evening, about a month after I had started paying closer attention to the phenomenon, I decided to try participating more actively. I had recently completed the restoration of a beautiful 1920s Westminster chime clock that had been silent since the 1960s. The repair had been challenging, requiring the fabrication of several replacement parts and careful adjustment of the chiming mechanism. As 3:17 approached, I positioned myself near the Westminster clock and waited. When the nightly chiming began, I gently helped the Westminster clock join the chorus, manually triggering its chimes to harmonize with the others. The effect was immediate and remarkable. The other clocks seemed to welcome the Westminster's voice, adjusting their own rhythms to create space for its deep, resonant tones. But more than that, I began to hear something else in the harmony. A piano playing along with the clocks in perfect synchronization. The piano melody was beautiful and complex, weaving between the clock chimes in a way that enhanced both the musical and mechanical elements of the composition. As the chiming reached its conclusion, I heard Margaret's voice clearly for the first time. "Welcome to the ensemble," she said warmly. "It's wonderful to have someone who understands that time and music are really the same thing." I found myself responding without thinking. "Thank you for including me. This is beautiful." "Your grandfather was part of our evening concerts for many years," Margaret continued. "He understood that clocks and musical instruments are both about creating rhythm and harmony. We've missed having someone who could help the timepieces find their voices." Over the following months, the 3:17 concerts became the highlight of my day. Each evening, I would join Margaret and the clocks in creating musical compositions that blended mechanical precision with artistic expression. Margaret taught me to listen to the individual personality of each timepiece, to understand how different mechanisms could contribute different musical elements to the overall composition. A grandfather clock with a deep, slow pendulum could provide the bass line, while delicate mantle clocks offered melodic flourishes. I learned that the chiming wasn't random supernatural activity. It was a collaborative musical performance between the spirit of someone who had loved music and the mechanical souls of timepieces that had been crafted to mark time with beauty and precision. But Margaret also taught me about the deeper connection between time and music. Both involve rhythm, both create patterns that give structure to human experience, and both can evoke powerful emotions through their careful arrangement. Every clock, Margaret explained during one of our evening conversations, is really a musical instrument. The ticking is its heartbeat, the chiming is its voice. When you repair a clock, you're not just fixing a mechanism, you're helping an instrument find its song again. This understanding transformed how I approached clock repair during my daytime work. Instead of thinking purely in mechanical terms, I began to consider the musical potential of each timepiece. I started paying attention to the quality of a clock's tick, adjusting mechanisms not just for accuracy, but for the most pleasing sound. I experimented with chiming arrangements that would complement the evening concerts, and I began to develop an intuitive sense of which repairs would most improve a clock's musical contribution. Word spread through the community that Pendletons had developed an almost magical ability to restore not just the timekeeping function of clocks, but their aesthetic and emotional appeal as well. Customers began reporting that clocks repaired at my shop seemed to run more smoothly, keep better time, and somehow make their homes feel more peaceful and welcoming. Mrs. Patterson, whose family's 1890s grandfather clock I had recently restored, told me that the clock's gentle chiming now helped her fall asleep each night. "It's not just telling time," she said. "It's like having a lullaby that knows exactly when you need it." The Yamamoto family brought me a collection of small clocks that had belonged to their grandmother, hoping to restore them as wedding gifts for their children. When I returned the clocks, each one perfectly calibrated and harmoniously tuned, they said the timepieces seemed to bring good luck and happiness to their new homes. I realized that Margaret's influence was extending beyond our evening concerts. She was helping me understand that clock repair was really about preserving and enhancing the relationship between people and time itself. Clocks don't just measure time, they help people feel connected to the rhythm of daily life, the passage of seasons, and the continuity of family traditions. When a clock is working properly, it becomes part of the emotional landscape of a home. One particularly meaningful repair involved a young father named David Kim, who brought me a small anniversary clock that had belonged to his late mother. "She wound this clock every day for 30 years, he told me. "After she passed away, we couldn't get it to run properly. My daughter asks about it all the time. She remembers her grandmother showing her how to watch the little golden balls spin." The anniversary clock had a complex movement that required delicate adjustment, but as I worked on it, I found myself thinking about the role this clock had played in 3 generations of family life. When I returned the clock to David, it was running perfectly, its golden pendulum balls rotating smoothly and its gentle tick marking the passage of family time. A week later, David called to tell me that his daughter had started a bedtime ritual of winding the clock with her father, just as she had done with her grandmother. "It's like having a piece of my mother back in our home," he said. "Thank you for understanding that this wasn't just about fixing a clock." These experiences taught me that Margaret and I were partners in something much larger than mechanical repair. We were helping people maintain connections across time to their families, their histories, and their sense of place in the ongoing rhythm of life. The evening concerts continued to evolve and grow more sophisticated. As I repaired more clocks and they joined the ensemble, our musical compositions became richer and more complex. Margaret began teaching me about musical theory, showing me how the mathematical relationships that govern mechanical timing are the same principles that create harmony in music. Time signatures in music and gear ratios in clockwork follow the same mathematical patterns, she explained during one of our sessions. When you understand that connection, you can make clocks that don't just keep time, they make time beautiful. I started incorporating this knowledge into my repair work, adjusting mechanisms to create pleasing harmonic relationships between different timepieces. Customers who own multiple clocks often commented that they seemed to work together, creating a sense of temporal harmony throughout their homes. The most remarkable development came during my 6th month of working with Margaret. I had been restoring a particularly complex astronomical clock that displayed not just time, but also moon phases, planetary positions, and various calendar information. The clock had been silent for decades, its intricate mechanism seized by age and neglect. As I worked to restore each component, Margaret provided guidance that went far beyond mechanical knowledge. She helped me understand how the different astronomical functions could contribute to our evening concerts, creating rhythmic patterns that reflected celestial movements. When the restoration was complete, the astronomical clock became the conductor of our ensemble. Its complex chiming patterns, synchronized with actual celestial events, provided a framework that connected our earthly music to the vast rhythms of the universe itself. During our first concert with the astronomical clock leading the ensemble, something extraordinary happened. The music we created together seemed to transcend the physical limitations of the shop, reaching out into the neighborhood and beyond. Sarah from the bookstore next door later told me that she had heard our music more clearly than ever before, and that other shop owners on the block had mentioned hearing beautiful chiming that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Mrs. Rodriguez from the senior center called to say that residents had been asking about the lovely music they heard at night, wondering if there was a new concert series in the neighborhood. I realized that Margaret and I, working with the community of timepieces we had restored together, were creating something that served the entire community. A nightly reminder that time itself could be beautiful, harmonious, and connecting rather than merely functional. I've been running Pendleton's clock repair for over a year now, and the evening concerts with Margaret remain the most meaningful part of my work. Each clock I repair becomes part of our growing ensemble. Each restoration adds new voices to our musical conversations about time and memory. But more than that, I've learned that some partnerships transcend the normal boundaries between life and death. Margaret and I share a commitment to understanding and preserving the beauty inherent in mechanical time, and that shared purpose has created a collaboration that serves both the living and the departed. The shop has become a place where time itself is honored, not just as a practical necessity, but as a source of beauty, continuity, and connection. Every tick, every chime, every perfectly calibrated movement contributes to an ongoing symphony that celebrates the human relationship with time. Customers often comment that there's something special about the atmosphere in Pendleton's, something that makes them feel peaceful and connected to the larger rhythms of life. They don't know about Margaret or our evening concerts, but they can sense that the clocks here are more than just timepieces, they're participants in something beautiful and meaningful. I still work late most evenings, and I still join Margaret at 3:17 a.m. for our concerts. Each night brings new musical possibilities as different clocks take leading or supporting roles in our compositions. Some nights, when atmospheric conditions are just right, I can see Margaret at the piano that exists somehow in the same space as my workshop. She appears as she must have in life, dedicated, joyful, completely absorbed in the music we're creating together. The evening concerts have taught me that time isn't just about duration or scheduling. It's about rhythm, harmony, and the connections that persist across generations. Every clock I repair carries forward the stories of the people who have owned it, the moments it has marked, and the family traditions it has supported. Working with Margaret has shown me that dedication to craftsmanship and beauty creates bonds that transcend individual lifetimes. The music we make together honors both the mechanical precision of timepieces and the human need for beauty in daily life. Pendleton's clock repair continues to fix the unfixable, but now I understand that the real work isn't just about mechanical restoration. It's about helping people maintain their connection to time as something beautiful and meaningful rather than merely functional. And every evening at 3:17 a.m., Margaret and I remind the neighborhood that time itself can sing if you know how to listen to its voice.